This is a relatively short webinar. We like doing them that way, but it's only 30 minutes, so we're not going to waste any time. We really are just going to jump in. Tell you briefly about Korsky. If you don't know too much about us, we are a vocational intelligence platform partnered with 200 plus campuses today. We have a suite of solutions that are purpose-built for the career ed space, touching lots of different pieces of the student life cycle. And we're currently making a $25 million investment in helping schools just like yours train 1 million additional essential workers. We are true believers in the space and in the mission and of the promise of vocational education. We'd love for the opportunity to tell you more about that, actually. Today's speakers are Jacob Bonifield of Counsel at Dentons Law Firm, the largest law firm in the world. And Jake comes from the career education space. He was previously the Director of Government Affairs at Rasmussen College, and he is an expert in higher education law, representing many institutions to both Congress and the Department of Education. And I am myself. I am Adam Figueroa, the Vice President of Marketing here at Korsky. And as I said, as I promised, we're going to cover a lot in the next 30 minutes. You're going to receive an overview of the ongoing negotiated rulemaking efforts at DOE. In particular, changes that are being discussed around gainful employment and 90/10. You're going to understand what your institution should be thinking about and doing now, and as we head into 2023. And then I'm going to give you a brief overview of how Korsky helps vocational schools get in front of compliance challenges in order to improve student outcomes and achieve what I like to call institutional upside. And again, I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. But in the meantime, again, short webinar, so we are just plowing forward today. Jake, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adam. Great to be here with all of you. Appreciate your time as we go through topics that really couldn't be more timely. I think Adam nailed my bio well. The only thing I'd add is that I've sat in many of the chairs that the attendees today are sitting in as an in-house advocate and counselor, and then now in my current role advising a plethora of institutions, both private, public, and proprietary, on the changing landscape in U.S. higher education. So thrilled to be with you and excited to kind of get started. I think on our next slide, we've got a few bullet points that are likely familiar to the majority of you. My goal is to give a kind of a high-level overview of what's taking place at the U.S. Department of Education, but also lend some thought and context for individual operators on how you might prepare your institution to best adapt to and comply with, each of the rules and regulations we're going to be addressing here, even as, the field goals are kind of moving on us in real time. The Negotiated Rulemaking Committee is meeting today to discuss several of the topics you see on the screen, but from their previous meetings, from public indicators, and from what we know of previous iterations of each of these topics, we have a pretty good feel for what to expect. And so my goal today is to give you kind of the tools to begin thinking through compliance and kind of a prevent defense, if you will, to make sure your institution has the least amount of kind of regulatory risk as we prepare to adapt to these new regulations. And so again, these topics are likely familiar to you. We'll start with BDR, borrower defense to repayment, which is the kind of the regime under which the Higher Education Act affords the U.S. Department of Education several bases on which individual student loan borrowers can rely to try to get their loans forgiven. The rub comes from an institutional standpoint in that BDR has two components. It has initial loan forgiveness, which students are seeking, and there's obviously a lot of political winds behind it. I wouldn't be the quintessential lawyer advocate if I didn't make note of the fact that these efforts to provide kind of large-scale, wide-ranging loan relief, student loan relief to borrowers have stalled in Congress. They've not made it to any significant juncture in the lawmaking process, the legislative process, and equally, President Biden his initial indications are that he's unwilling to use sort of the executive pen to do this by executive order. That could still change. But in lieu of action on those two fronts, we've seen student advocates, and in particular the progressive wing of the House Democrats, sort of move to door number 3, right? And so now we're looking at borrower defense to repayment, a topic and rule with which many of you might be familiar since it was first promulgated in the waning days of the Obama administration. We're seeing that kind of take on a new, new light, if you will, and gain even more teeth and present an even larger potential liability to institutions. So we'll spend a significant amount of time on that. We'll talk about gainful employment. Again, if you're on this webinar, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with GE in previous iterations. We'll talk a little bit about where that's headed. The 90-10 rule, administrative capability, closed school discharges, a number of these broader topics that are coming into play. Again, these might have been kind of tame topics in the past. Today, I think smart operators of colleges, administrators, compliance specialists are looking at these anew, if you will, in light of what the department intends to do over the next few months with the draft rule. But we'll get into all that. That's just a high-level preview and a primer. If you want to move to the next slide, I'd like to start with borrower defense to repayment. And I will say this is a bit of a specialty of mine within my practice, helping institutions think through this rule and the sort of categories of liability that it portends. This is, at a high level, borrower defense to repayment has been in the Higher Education Act for decades. It was little used, and it was only, as I mentioned earlier, in the waning days of the Obama administration, based on a memorandum that came from Senator Elizabeth Warren to the Department of Education, pointing out that this relatively unused, benign, element of the Higher Education Act could effectively be weaponized. And so what we've seen with BDR is that whereas this was used sparingly in the previous couple of decades for unique cases, including closed school discharges, which is a subcategory of BDR, disability, instances where kind of one-off situations merited student loan relief, the Department of Education has effectively weaponized this to move from shield to sword, as we say, kind of in the legal realm, right? This is now becoming an avenue through which students are going to seek or are expected to seek billions in loan forgiveness. And again, the bulk of that liability is going to be to land on institutions to recap, if you will. So that at a high level is what borrower defense to repayment does. The status quo has been that borrower defense claims could be based on violations of state law. So you can imagine a scenario in which you've got a consumer protection statute on the books in Illinois, and that an institution puts out some, let's say deceptive or perceivably deceptive marketing materials. You've got a student who enrolls based in part on relying on those marketing materials, and they say, hey, this is a violation of state law. They go to the department, they make their case to the department. It's important to understand that institutions are not in the room when these claims are made and posited to the U.S. Department of Education. And so it's very unlike and differs significantly from a typical courthouse setting, right? A typical civil suit. You've got, a neutral arbiter. You've got, rules of procedure, of evidence. You've got due process safeguards. Almost all of that goes out the window in the context of borrower defense to repayment. And yet, if that claim is approved and the department chooses to go after the institution, which they most certainly are going to do in the majority of cases here, again, the institution is going to have to come up with those funds that were discharged. So, at any rate, the biggest two developments, I would say, in borrower defense to repayment has been the advocacy of a single federal standard for all claims. And without going too far into the kind of the legal weeds, I think it's a sophisticated audience that understands you've got various levels of burdens of proof that have to be met in civil versus criminal cases, depending on if you're arguing the merits of a civil case or damages or what have you. But the lowest of these, certainly we always think beyond a reasonable doubt in the criminal context, the lowest of these is preponderance of the evidence, which, there's a lot of theories out there. It's basically, 51%, 50 plus one. that the claim has merit. So it's a very low bar. This is what U.S. Department of Education is proposing to replace the existing patchwork of state standards with a single federal standard on preponderance of the evidence, which is a very low bar, obviously. But in addition to setting the bar low, the U.S. Department of Education is proposing to, essentially suggest categories under which students can file borrower defense claims. And we'll get into this on the next slide in just a moment, but I do want to flag it for you all that this is not going to be, it's not going to have the burdens of a typical lawsuit in any manner. And increasingly, the department is leaning towards making these processes nearly automatic. So if a school, in the department's view, is found to have misled students, let's say in a job placement rate advertisement, which is kind of a topic that, for those of you following the department's announcements today and yesterday, is very much in the news. If they determine that the institution did this in a given period of time, it's conceivable that after an initial fact finding, if we want to call it that, initial informal determination that the loans ought to be forgiven for students who attended during that period in which the advertisement or the materials or what have you ran, they can now effectively create their own group claims and go in and, sort of sui sponte, on their own merit, go in and forgive loans for an entire tranche of borrowers. Well, you can imagine the potential liabilities that could create for institutions. So we'll get to that in a little bit, some more detail, but I also want to point out that the statute of limitations that ED is proposing for an institution. So how long is an institution on the hook for a potential triggering action and student claims? It's 6 years from the borrower's last date of attendance. So it's a long time, and ED, if they have their way through the remainder of these negotiated rulemaking sessions, intends to allow borrowers to do this at almost any time. So at any rate, this is a new frontier of potential claims. They're also hoping to use the group process to, essentially lasso groups of students, as I put on there, based on previous secretarial actions. So if you had a CDR failure, if you failed to meet administrative capability, if you tripped any wire within kind of the rat's nest of requirements that are hoisted on institutions, that could be a BDR risk. So I would encourage everyone to engage counsel, be it internal or external. I do this all the time with institutions where I'll go through and we'll do kind of a heat map of potential liabilities based on what you're doing in admissions, what's in your academic catalog, any student-facing communication, anything that's out there that could be a potential risk point, and then develop a plan for minimizing this. But I would not sleep on the billions of dollars in potential liability associated with BDR. So if we want to move to the next slide, I can lend a little color. There's always a risk when you're talking to a lawyer, it's like, well, all you see is liability all day. Is this really, that big of a deal? Is it a true risk to me? I would encourage you to take a look at these categories for claims. So substantial misrepresentation, that was in the initial rule. We're somewhat used to that. Omissions is a deceptively dangerous category, because if you can imagine, there are many things that we as institutions, put out to students, that we discuss with students, for which there are not clear guardrails. Job placement rates being kind of foremost among these. And so the notion of that you omitted something that ought to have been in a communication, but there's no standard for what has to be in those communications. I mean, the risk there is pretty self-evident, right? You don't know what you don't know. And that suddenly becomes a basis of liability. Breach of contract and adjudications will be familiar to most. Aggressive recruitment, though, is the new addition to this. And this is the kind of elephant buried in a mouse hole. And I won't read all of this, but one of the triggers for aggressive recruitment that could spawn a claim is exploiting a consumer's fears, anxieties, insecurities, or any specific misfortune or circumstance of such gravity as to impair the consumer's judgment, to influence the consumer's decision with regard to the institution. 3 years of law school, close to a decade in this space, and I can't tell you exactly what meets that definition on an ongoing basis, because I have no ability as an institution to know what a consumer's individual fears, anxieties, insecurities, or specific misfortune or circumstances are. but those suddenly just became grounds for potential borrower defense to repayment claim. So these are, I think, hugely important. I just saw a quick note about copy of slides. I'm happy to follow up with anybody interested with this language and talk through it as well. But we're talking about a massive expansion of liability here for institutions. And those are just a couple morsels of that, because I know we got a short window. If we want to move from there on to the next slide here, GE, most of you guys are going to be familiar with the gainful employment regiment. Again, happy to talk through any element of this individually afterwards. They're headed towards a sort of 2014 rule redux. I mean, they've got a couple substantive changes that they're likely going to incorporate. The department is in a new gainful employment rule. They're going to move from the 3-tiered, for those of you who remember, a pass, zone, fail scheme to a simple pass, fail. So you don't have, sort of the cushion of having a program in the zone that can stay there for, I think it was 3 out of 4 years or what have you. This is simple pass fail. It's, 2 out of 3 consecutive years, and you'll lose Title IV eligibility. They're looking at a discretionary debt to earnings calculation of 20% or less, has you passing 8% or less on the annual side. And they're taking pains to ostensibly exempt small programs from having to comply with this, just have to report their rates. But it's not quite that simple, because failing small program rates can be incorporated in the context of an administrative capability snag that I'll talk to you about in a moment. But the kind of high level crystallization of this as operators is we're talking about double, triple, quadruple jeopardy. We're talking about misses on one schema of rules that then trigger, whether it's borrower defense, gainful employment, administrative capability, FRR, that could, sort of ensnare you in serious consequences without something in the way of kind of a real big warning sign. And so it's important to try to understand all of these things in detail, but also in the larger picture of your compliance needs and requirements. They're proposing to include Parent Plus in the calculations, a terrible decision that could be catastrophic. I'll also mention that an additional potential trigger on this end and on supplemental regulations is deceiving statements made about an institution's tax status. And obviously we know where that's targeted. So I'll mention all of that. Also mention there are supplemental standards that the department is contemplating that would trigger consequences for any institution, for-profit, public, private, nonprofit, if they make any misstatements with respect to job placement rates, with respect to administrative spend numbers, with respect to a whole host of relatively ambiguous and undefined areas, including job placement rates, that in the context of programmatic and institutional outcomes that could trip people up on any number of levels because there aren't set standards in place. So I'm happy to go through all of that with anybody else who's interested, and see if I neglected any kind of important notes in this. I guess I would say, the other trigger that I said I was going to mention, if schools receive less than half of their revenue, or more than half, more than half of their revenue is attributed to programs that are failing, they will instantly have tripped an FRR trigger and an administrative capability trigger that could lead to a requirement of posting of the letter of credit. So, all of these things are related, and it's sort of a domino effect in terms of what they portend for institutions. So I know that's kind of the lightning round. We can move on to the next slide. Yeah, 90-10. They're talking about they're going to include within the 90% calculation based on the agreement was worked out in Congress. They're going to include most VA funds and the like. And so we have huge issues there. I mentioned the double jeopardy trigger administrative capability that could lead to a posting of a letter of credit. And the other thing is under FRR, if an institution's programs determined ineligible under gainful for the next award year comprise at least 10% of the T4 funds distributed in the previous year, this will trigger the need to post a letter of credit as well. So there are landmines all over this thing. I know that probably just scratches the surface. Very happy to follow up with any of you who are interested. But I think that, Adam, is probably the highlights.
All right. Well, thank you, Jake, for that. As Jake said several times, he's happy to do follow-ups with everyone, and we will give you his contact information at the end. So just stick around for a couple more minutes. I just want to tell everyone a little bit more about Korsky. You know, our mission is really you. We partner exclusively with career and technical colleges to deliver solutions that increase student engagement, support your compliance. Of course, that's what we're talking about today. And ultimately, leveraging those two things to drive stronger student outcomes. I mentioned earlier, we work with 200 institutional partners across a broad range of sectors, from beauty and wellness, trades, allied health, EMS. And we really think about compliance as an entire framework that encompasses the entire student life cycle, right? Not just one thing, but really multiple areas of exposure for the institution, from attendance to the tracking and monitoring of student skills, the administration of evaluations, and then of course reporting as well. And I'd like to just tell you quickly about each of those things. So from an attendance standpoint, and again, I'm saying all of this from the angle of compliance, you know, the question that is really important is, can you prove that students were where they needed to be, when they needed to be there, and how long they were there? With Korsky, we enable you to do that easily for classes in any modalities. So whether that's on campus, online, a hybrid of the two, synchronous learning, asynchronous learning, even externships, it's very easy to manage all of that attendance, clock in, clock out, signing hours, and so forth. There's a multi-layered verification process to prevent fraud. So whether that's a QR code, voice recognition, geofencing for an externship, or a combination of several of these things, just helps you be much more buttoned up. There's a lot of detailed data though, in terms of live attendance, last activity recorded, to make sure that you're, you know, in the right place as far as, you know, when you're doing those, you know, Title IV drawdown funds, and making sure that you're not doing it prematurely. You can see that students were there on the first day of class, for example. And this applies to instructors too. Did they start and end class on time? It's all digital. There's a full audit trail, no manual data entry at all for the SIS. This is what some of that looks like. The student interface right on their iPhone to check in using a QR code. This is what the administrator, this is an example of an administrator record looking at a specific student, right, and their attendance history. In terms of tracking skills, the question is, are my students progressing towards graduation and learning the required skills on time? We give you real-time visibility into that, eliminating paper checklists and the potential for fraud there. And actually, this has nothing to do with compliance, but it happens to serve as a very powerful motivational tool for students when they can see themselves making progress towards graduation. So again, you can drill down and see that for individual students, right? Are they getting the skills that's necessary to meet the requirements of graduation? Now, this is a little bit related to evaluations and assessments as well. And again, I think there's a compliance component here. You see it right here, right? Can you streamline the administration of quizzes and tests, and at the same time help yourself prove satisfactory academic performance for each student? Here we have capabilities that include built-in ID verification, again, for fraud prevention. It supports multiple question types, short answer, multiple choice. If you want a time box, a quiz or a test, it's easy to do. And it can be used for observational assessments at the same time. Here's an example of that. For example, did the student, was the student dressed appropriately for the necessary safety procedures and so forth. Tracking and monitoring all of that. And then finally, in terms of audit-ready reports, can you auto-generate and auto-send properly formatted reports to regulators? Jake mentioned earlier, borrower defense claims. With these reports, you have proof of services delivered because it's tied back to the attendance. It's tied back to the skills tracking, right? Can help you detect and prevent instructor fraud. Again, easy to drill down in this data by date range, campus, class, and so forth. And it saves a lot of time in the preparation for these audits. Now, ultimately, and again, there's a screenshot of that. Now, I mentioned institutional upside at the very beginning, and the way that I like to think about this is compliance isn't just about protecting your downside. I think there's a real upside to all of this too, which is when you can be buttoned up in all of these different areas and free from having to worry about the tracking of attendance, the monitoring of skills tracking, it frees you up to do what you do best, which is provide great education to students and get them on a better path in their careers. And so all of these points of data that we've just talked about sort of comes full circle to when you have real-time visibility into what's going on, when you have predictors into when there might be an issue or a risk factor around a student not being present in class as often or falling behind a little bit in terms of earning the necessary skills, you can get in front of it early. You can intervene early. And that allows you to ultimately improve retention and keep more students on the path to graduation and placement. And it becomes this virtuous circle that drives enrollment for the institution. And that's how we think about that. And this is an example of this, right? This is a drill down of a particular student, Chelsea, and it's pulling in all of this data, her attendance rate, lateness rate, what her academic performance looks like. And it predicts a score around the likelihood of this student to churn and drop out of the program. And you see that very early on when there is time to get in front of it and keep Chelsea on that successful path to graduation. Again, just an example of how we take all these different indicators, which are related to compliance, but move it into institutional upside, right? And driving a positive for the institution and for the school at the same time. I told you we were going to get all of this done in 30 minutes, and I don't lie. We've included our contact information here for Jake and for myself as well. We want to thank all of our attendees for giving us their last 30 minutes with us. We're both willing to have follow-up conversations with you about anything that you've heard today. And we look forward to hearing from you, and we look forward to being in touch. If you have any questions, you can get a hold of us over email. If you sent something through the chat for the webinar, we have a record of those, so we will close the loop with you there as well. And on that note, thank you, everyone. Jake, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.